9 months into a diplomatic dispute that has seen little to no resolution, China will soon be dealing with a new Canadian representative. Today, the Feds named Dominic Barton its new ambassador to China, filling a seat that's been vacant since January when John McCallum was fired from the position. Barton is a key economic advisor for the federal government and a high-profile business executive with years of experience working in China. The CBC's Katie Simpson is here with all the details. Hi, Katie.
Hi.
What can you tell us about Mr. Barton and why the government would have chosen him?
Dominic Barton is the kind of guy that corporate leaders and world leaders go to looking for advice. He's hugely respected within both of those realms, and it appears the Trudeau government is relieved that he's accepting this new challenge. The announcement came today, and his name was held very tightly. The government did not want this to get out because they were afraid if China had the opportunity to embarrass Canada or reject Canada's choice, that they would probably try to do that as a way to further escalate those ongoing tensions. So there was a real fear around that. So when the announcement was made this afternoon about Dominic Barton's appointment, he was actually speaking at a business conference in Toronto, and there was a standing ovation for him in the crowd when that moment came, and the moderator stood up and said, okay, this is the guy going in there. Now, as you mentioned, he has worked extensively in China. He worked for a consulting firm called McKinsey. Now, that firm has been the subject of some intense criticism after the New York Times did an intense investigation looking at its operations in China, specifically after it held a very lavish corporate retreat about 6 kilometers from a Uyghur internment camp. So that was something that certainly got a lot of attention, and some of their other operations in China have certainly been the focus of some intense criticism. Mr. Barton himself has been a very public advocate for Canada deepening ties with China. In his role on that Economic Advisory Committee, one way to grow the economy, he said, would be to deepen trade with Asia, particularly with China. But today, Chrystia Freeland was asked about those concerns, particularly about what he's done in his private life. Here's what she said.
As with other people moving from a distinguished career in the private sector to public service, Mr. Barton will have to ensure that there are no conflicts between his personal business interests and his public service, and that absolutely does involve stepping down from boards, ensuring that any assets that he holds and decisions taken about them are not in conflict with his service to Canada.
Barton has been considered for this role in the past. Back in 2016, before John McCallum was appointed, there had been conversations between the Prime Minister's office and Barton about it at that time. It didn't work out at that time, and instead John McCallum got the job, and we all know what happened there.
We sure do. Tell us a bit more about what kind of message, I guess, the government is hoping to send. This isn't a lifelong career diplomat. It's a political decision, right? A political appointment.
Chrystia Freeland spoke about it a little bit today at her news conference. Canada wants to send the message to China that here is a guy who has the ear of the Prime Minister. He's a senior advisor to the Prime Minister. He knows Chrystia Freeland really well. This is a guy who has the Prime Minister's ear, and he is ready to have a conversation anytime, any place, and because Canada really wants to de-escalate what's been going on, thaw those tensions. We asked Robert Malley about this. Robert Malley is the head of Crisis Group. That is, of course, the company that employs Michael Kovrig, one of the 2 detained Canadians. He is extremely excited about this appointment because he believes that Mr. Barton is going to make securing the release of the 2 detained Canadians a priority to his time as ambassador.
I've gotten to know him over the past several months, and I know how dedicated he is to securing the release of the Canadian citizens, in particular of Michael Kovrig, from China, and I think he has the credibility and stature to deliver that message.
We know that Chrystia Freeland presented Barton's name to the Chinese foreign minister when they were meeting on the sidelines of the ASEAN Summer last month. We reached out to Roland Paris, who's a former Liberal foreign policy advisor. He says the fact that China did approve this appointment is a sign that there could be a bit of thawing in those tensions.
I think it's a positive signal. It follows the resumption of high-level communications between the 2 governments, which had been blocked for a while. And at the very least, we need to be talking to China during this difficult period. Having an ambassador in place will make it easier to do that on a daily basis.
One thing worth pointing out that this appointment comes in the days before a general election. The writ period is expected to begin. The Conservatives were not consulted on this, nor were any other opposition parties. The Conservatives today put out a statement saying this is just the Liberals advancing Liberal. It's another Liberal insider being appointed into a position like this, so they're not too pleased. This is sort of essentially saying it's too little, too late.
All right, thank you, Katie. The CBC's Katie Simpson. What are some of the challenges ahead for this new ambassador? Guy Saint-Jacques served as Canada's ambassador to China from 2012 to 2016. He's now senior fellow at the University of Alberta's China Institute. He joins us via FaceTime from the Isle of Skye in Scotland. Hi, Mr. Saint-Jacques. Nice to see you.
Hello, Vashi.
Thanks for your time. Let me just start off by getting your reaction to Dominic Barton's appointment as Canada's new ambassador to China.
Well, I would say overall it's good news because we are at the stage where I think we needed to have an ambassador in place. And I gathered that when Minister Freeland met with Minister Wang Yi at the ASEAN summit, I think it was at the end of July, they had agreed to exchange ambassadors. And since both ministers agreed on a process to try to lessen tensions between the two countries, I think it's important to have an ambassador in place in Beijing to help out and hopefully to work towards the normalization of bilateral relations. But on that, I would say that we will have to see how much progress he will be able to accomplish.
Yeah, and I'll ask you about that in a second. About the pick as Mr. Barton specifically, my understanding is that the government even wanted to, when your term was up, replace you in 2016, I believe it was, with Mr. Barton. What do you think of him as an individual as the choice?
Well, I think that he is a good choice. Despite the fact that he does not speak Mandarin and he is not a career diplomat, he has been many times to China in his capacity with McKinsey. He has also lived in Shanghai, so he knows the country, he knows the leaders. Furthermore, obviously, he has contacts with the Prime Minister's office in Ottawa, and that's important if taking into account that China is our second most important relationship in the world after the United States. This being said, where I still have some hesitation is the fact that the Chinese have been very clear. They have said that it will not be possible to normalize the relations until Mrs. Meng has been released. And on that, if there's no miracle, we have to expect that Mrs. Meng will stay in Canada for many years. And therefore, I'm not sure how much access Mr. Barton will have compared to a career diplomat.
What kind of message do you think the government was trying to get across by picking somebody who isn't a career diplomat? I mean, they could have chosen someone who was from the diplomatic circle. Instead, they went the more political route. What message does that send from your perspective?
Well, I know that the Prime Minister and people in his office regard Mr. Barton, they have him in very high regard. And obviously, he is a very accomplished person, very good economist, has done a lot of very useful work for Canada and around the world. And therefore, I think that the Prime Minister wants to send a message that he is appointing someone who is close to him, who knows the priorities of Canada, who knows China and China as a leader. But, in the in reality, the Chinese will say, okay, he is sending someone important, as he would if he were to appoint an ambassador to Washington. But let's remember that for their part, the Chinese always appoint career diplomats abroad.
We know that Mr. Barton has encouraged or suggested deepening trade ties with China in the past. He also led an economic advisory council for the government, part of which made that very, very kind of recommendation. Do you think that the current context would necessitate sort of a revisiting of that position right now?
Well, in my view, the government has no choice but to revisit because I have said this in the past. Now that we have seen the dark side of China, how they can be brutal when a country does something that they don't like, I think that we have to review a number of things. In my view, it would no longer be possible to try to conclude a free trade agreement with China, because to do that you need mutual respect. Obviously, the respect is gone, and therefore we have seen what they have done with canola and other Canadian products. Therefore, I think the conditions are not there. And in my view, it will be very difficult to come back to the situation that we had prior to this problem we have had since the arrest of Mrs. Meng. And therefore, it will require on the part of the government to have a more realistic approach towards China.
What does realistic, I guess, approach mean? And have you heard anything more? I know that you're kind of keeping an eye very closely on what's happening with Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. Have you heard anything more about their situation?
Well, obviously they are still detained. They are still faced with difficult conditions, and on that front, I know how the Chinese operate. I don't expect that their situation will change much, since since now we are in a situation where they have been formally charged. That means that the clock is ticking. It will take about 18 months altogether to complete the judicial process, which means by November of next year, they will be sentenced. I expect a very harsh sentence especially for Michael Kovrig. And so the conditions from that perspective have not changed. China has refrained from applying further sanctions against Canada. I think in that regard, the campaign that has been pursued by the government to try to rally international support has been effective. Of course, now we have to continue to put pressure on the Americans to try to help us out. But, we have to. The reality is that the things are not looking very good in terms of a possible trade agreement between China and the U.S.
Okay, I have to leave it there, but thanks so much for your time this afternoon, Mr. Saint-Jacques. That's Guy Saint-Jacques, former ambassador to China.
As with other people moving from a distinguished career in the private sector to public service, Mr. Barton will have to ensure that there are no conflicts between his personal business interests and his public service, and that absolutely does involve stepping down from boards, ensuring that any assets that he holds and decisions taken about them are not in conflict with his service to Canada.
Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland is defending the federal government's decision to make its economic advisor the next ambassador to China. Dominic Barton will head to Beijing once China formally accepts his appointment. As you heard Minister Freeland say, there are steps he must take to avoid conflicts of interest due to his business ties with China. Could that become a problem? We're back with the Power Panel. Amanda Alvaro, Tim Powers, Kathleen Monk, and Chris Hall. Amanda, I'll start with you. Let's start with we'll get into some of the potential conflicts, but first, What message do you think the Liberals were trying to send with Mr. Barton as their choice versus like a longtime diplomat?
Well, I think that he has a lot of credibility with both Chinese leadership and as somebody in business who's done a lot of business in China, lived in China, has strong relationships in China. I think there's some cachet with the types of roles that he's held, as well as a network, which is really key and really important. I think right now, obviously, there's a focus on the two Michaels who remain detained and having somebody who potentially could be a window to open up new dialogue, new discussions there. And then obviously somebody who understands the economic implications of the trade arrangements between Canada and China. So hopefully he can service both of those needs that Canada finds themselves in right now.
It's interesting, Kathleen, because most of what I've heard publicly from Mr. Barton, including as economic advisor to the government in that report, they advocated for very much a deepening of economic ties with China. And you'd have to think that at this juncture, that's a really hard thing to be advocating for, given the detainment, as Amanda says, of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor.
It's true. People in this town in Ottawa would know him from that report that he did, the Advisory Council that came out in 2017, where we all kind of what his economic recommendations were. But I think actually it would help because he knows the China investment community so well. He'll be able to help Canadian businesses in China and vice versa, Chinese businesses businesses trying to come to Canada. But more than that, he'll also be able to explain China to the cabinet table, which is really his primary job as ambassador now. I think one of the key things, I agree with much of what Amanda said. I think that what I would add is that there is this interesting aspect that at the ASEAN summit, Freeland, there was a promise made essentially that if we appoint, they will appoint. Yeah. So we're kind of, the next thing to watch is hopefully they will appoint to us. And that is a signal of warming. I think it has to be taken as a signal of warning.
Even the approval, right? Eventually.
Warming. Warming, not warning, sorry. I think it's a sign of softening, and I think that's good. I don't know if it necessarily helps the situation of the two Michaels. I think it's still a very difficult file, but I think having someone, as Freeland said, who is so close to the Prime Minister, who is so trusted by the Prime Minister and Cabinet. Freeland herself spoke very at length about her relationship and how long she's known Mr. Barton, so that's also got to contribute.
What does it mean, though, there's an election, as we've been talking about now, and the election happens, say the Liberals aren't in power. This is a pretty political appointment, right?
Yeah, well, let me do my disclosure first. He's not the only one with the conflicts. I work with Tech Resources as an advisor. He was the chairman of the board of Tech. Tech does significant business in China. That, I think, is part of what the minister was talking about, and maybe an area of criticism, though I've never met Mr. Barton. I think there was a box to be checked. The government is vulnerable on a number of fronts, from the way it's managed its relationship with China, the troubles and the sad tragedy of the two Michaels still being imprisoned there. I think they had to do something. The easiest thing, though maybe not that easy in the end, was China, because China had to sign off, was putting an ambassador in. Whether Mr. Barton is able to bring about any resolution in the short term that helps the Liberals domestically, and more particularly helps the Michaels, to be seen. One of the criticisms the Conservatives are bringing, that he's a Liberal insider. I'm going to win friends and influence people here as I do my Dale Carnegie. That's a weak criticism. Mr. Barton is his own man. He's not benefiting beyond. He doesn't need to benefit from this particular appointment. I think he's a global player. I think the Chinese will respect that. I mean, he ran McKinsey & Company, which is one of the world's largest advisory services firms. Because of the work he's done with tech and elsewhere, he knows the Chinese business community. The challenge is going to be for him, can he adapt to being now an advisor and an ambassador? Not everybody can. On the surface, this looks like a good appointment.
I'm going to be the cautionary note here. I'm not sure having an ambassador in Beijing, once his credentials are accepted, actually changes the dynamic very much. I think from the Chinese point of view, at least talking to people who do business there still and talking to global affairs, is that Meng Wanzhou remains the unresolvable issue. And until she is released, nothing is going to normalize with China and Canada. That's the first thing. Secondly, I know we talked about his business ties, but he actually headed a company that did a lot of socio and economic work. So he's familiar with the culture. He's familiar with some of the lead players, and it's not just in the business community. So he has that opening ability to be able to talk about issues that show that he understands how China works and how the leadership thinks.
I just quickly want to add that Katie Simpson, our colleague, flagged that Tech Resources just announced that Mr. Barton will step down from the board of directors, effective immediately, to assume the role.
That is not a surprise, obviously. He would have no choice but to do so. And in fact, I don't think he's been chair at Tech for several months.
He's been chair of the board since October 1st, 2018.
So that's the first step. So does it suggest any kind of warming? I don't think it does. I think it's a recognition that we need a permanent envoy, and he does have that ability to pick up the phone and get Chrystia Freeland and Justin Trudeau on the line. To Kathleen's point, Sung Pei-Wu is the Chinese name that we've heard being appointed in reverse to become China's ambassador here. I think a very significant turn might be if his announced quickly, or if it takes still some time until after the election, for example. That would be, I think, a surer sign that China's at least willing now to maybe reopen some talks at the highest possible levels through two ambassadors to the various capitals who will have the ears of their government.
And I guess it allows the government, when pressed by the opposition during the next several weeks, to on China and on foreign policy towards China, to be able to say, hey, we did at least get an ambassador.
Yeah, and I don't think he's going to get some hearings here. I mean, the big fight we've had so far is just being heard here, whether it's on canola or pork or any other issue in which we have bilateral relations with China. There has been no ability to communicate with them directly, at least now with Dominic Barton, that avenue exists for the
It's interesting, too. The government was getting a lot of free external advice that, you should put Mr. Chrétien in there, or you should look at somebody from that particular era. They didn't take that advice. They took somebody
It would be hard to, given the comments that Mr. Chrétien
Agreed, but
made
before
on
those
this
comments were made, it seemed
Right.
like an interesting approach, because Mr. Chrétien is respected in China. They've gone with somebody where the insider comment comes from, who is very close to this prime minister. But I think you can't overstate the respect that Chinese leadership have for people of Mr. Barton's profile, who do business, who have not had issues with them doing business, who want to continue to have some kind of commercial relationship that matters, who also have a connection to the Prime Minister. The fact that this is a political appointment, I think both the Liberals and the Chinese will look upon favorably.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.